The quickest way to underestimate a black woman in a room full of old power is to assume that if she is not being announced, she must not belong there. Dr. Alina Brooks had spent most of her adult life in rooms built by men who had written history in a voice that rarely sounded like hers. She knew the smell of old archives, the chill of climate-controlled galleries, the polished condescension of donors who loved Black history as long as it remained framed, silent, and safely in the past. She knew what it meant to be admired in theory and doubted in person. But on the morning the museum guard decided to follow her through the Hall of Empire as though she were a threat to the collection, he did not know who she was. He saw a black woman in a navy coat, natural curls pinned neatly back, leather satchel over one shoulder, and the kind of calm posture that comes from years of having to carry credentials in your voice long before anyone asked for the paper versions. He decided without evidence and without shame that she did not look like the sort of person who entered the Sterling Museum of History by invitation. 10 minutes later, the curator would take a microphone, call her one of the foremost historians in the country, and introduce her as the keynote guest speaker for the museum's most important lecture of the year. But before that, there was the trailing, the suspicion, the little humiliations that powerful institutions call caution when they want to avoid calling it prejudice. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories about dignity, justice, and quiet comebacks that shake an entire room, subscribe and stay with me. The Sterling Museum sat in the center of Ashcroft Square like a polished argument about civilization. Its limestone steps were broad enough to make people feel smaller as they approached. Bronze banners hung from the columns with solemn lettering announcing the evening's event: Empire's Memory and the Making of National Myth. Inside, the marble floors reflected chandelier light in long, pale streaks, and the air carried that particular silence wealthy cultural institutions mistake for seriousness. The museum board was hosting a donor reception before the lecture. The city's academic elite would be there, along with trustees, political figures, old money patrons, and a journalist or two, all dressed in the subdued, expensive tones of people who wanted to appear as though they had never thought about clothes while spending a great deal on them. Dr. Alina Brooks arrived at 4:12 in the afternoon, earlier than necessary because she liked to see a room before it filled with other people's energy. She was 39, tall, precise in the way she moved, with a face that could hold warmth and scrutiny at the same time. Her research had changed debates in 3 universities and embarrassed 2 others. She had written a best-selling history of stolen labor and public memory that several museums quietly used to redesign their exhibits without always citing her. Students quoted her in graduate seminars. Journalists called her when a monument became controversial. Institutions invited her when they wanted authority, then sometimes visibly flinched when authority arrived in the body of a black woman who did not perform deference. She stepped through the revolving doors and paused just inside the foyer. To her left stood a polished brass directory. To her right, a floral arrangement large enough to have its own budget line. Straight ahead, a grand staircase split in 2 directions, beneath an oil portrait of the museum's founder, a man whose wealth had come from rail, steel, and the sort of 19th century arrangements polite plaques never fully explained. Alina took in the room with one sweep. She was looking for the event coordinator's desk or a staff sign-in point. Instead, she noticed the guard. He noticed her first. His name tag read, Martin Kaler, mid-50s, white, thick-necked, broad-shouldered, hair cut close at the sides. He had the stance of a man who enjoyed the authority of standing still while others moved around him. His museum blazer was neat. His earpiece sat against his jaw. He was not a policeman, not military, not anything that required the gravity he gave himself, but he wore his museum security badge with the seriousness some men reserve for office. He watched Alina for one beat too long before stepping away from the far wall. "Can I help you?" he asked. The question was not offensive on its face. Museums employ guards. Guards ask questions. But there are tones that turn language into a boundary. Martin's tone suggested not assistance, but screening. Alina gave him a brief professional smile. "Yes, I'm looking for check-in for the lecture." "Public admission opens at 6, he said. "I'm aware. I'm here for the speaker reception." His eyes moved over her coat, satchel, shoes, face, then back to the satchel. Do you have a staff pass? No, I'm a guest of the curator. Martin nodded as if indulging a claim that would soon correct itself. Name? Dr. Alina Brooks. He did not react to the title. Men like Martin often didn't, not because they failed to hear it, but because the title attached to a black woman rarely landed in the category they reserved for unquestioned legitimacy. He looked toward the main desk, then back at her. I don't have you on the front access sheet. That's not surprising, she said evenly. I'm not staff. I'm the keynote speaker. That should have ended it. Not because any stranger's self-description must be accepted without verification, but because the easiest next step was obvious. Check with the events office. Call the curator's assistant. Ask the front desk. Clarify. But prejudice rarely enjoys the most efficient path. It enjoys the path that preserves suspicion a little longer. Martin folded his hands in front of himself. The keynote speaker has not arrived yet. Alina almost smiled at that. Not out of amusement, out of familiarity. She had heard variations of that sentence before. The dean is on the way. The professor will join us shortly. We're waiting for Dr. Brooks. As though personhood had failed to match expectation, and so expectation must remain the reality until a whiter explanation appeared. She has, Alina said. Martin did not move. You'll need to wait in the public area until someone can verify. I'm happy to be verified, she said, by the events office, or the curator, or anyone who was involved in inviting me. He gave a short nod that said he had heard none of the substance and all of the resistance. The public area is through there. He gestured toward a roped gallery cafe on the lower level. Alina looked at the rope, then back at him. No, that word altered his posture. Excuse me? I'm not going to sit behind a rope in the cafe while you decide whether I look like someone who speaks at your event. His face tightened. Ma'am, I didn't say anything about how you look. No, she said. You didn't have to. The foyer had not been empty while they spoke. A pair of older white women in tailored coats slowed near the staircase. A young white staff assistant with a lanyard glanced over, then away. A middle-aged donor couple lingered by the entrance to the Roman Antiquities wing, alert in the quiet, predatory way people become when they sense a social scene forming and hope not to be implicated in it. Alina kept her voice measured. She knew exactly how quickly a black woman insisting on ordinary respect could be reframed as combative in institutions that prize composure only when it was convenient. Please call the curator's office, she said. Martin reached toward his radio but did not use it. Instead, he said, What organization are you with? That question, too, had a familiar shape. When legitimacy was not granted directly, it was sometimes loaned through a white institution. Who vouched for you? Which university? Which recognizable brand? Hudson College, Alina said. Department of History. Martin's expression did not shift enough. I'll need you to remain where you are. He stepped slightly to one side. Not enough to block her path outright, enough to imply that movement would become an issue. Alina looked up the staircase. Somewhere above, she knew, staff were setting up microphones, folding printed programs onto chairs, discussing lighting and seating placement. Somewhere above, Dr. Evelyn Pierce, his chief curator and tonight's host, was probably correcting floral arrangements or arguing about donor name cards. Alina had known Evelyn for 6 years, not intimately, but professionally, with the mutual respect of two women who had both survived male-dominated fields by becoming too competent to dismiss directly. Evelyn had invited her personally. The invitation had been clear, enthusiastic, and strategic. The museum was opening a new exhibit on imperial collecting and wanted intellectual seriousness attached to the launch. Alina intended to give them seriousness and some discomfort with it. She drew in a breath. Fine. Call her. Martin looked at his watch before finally lifting the radio. Control, this is Kaler in the main foyer. I need a verification on a possible event arrival. A possible event arrival. Alina felt the insult, small and surgical. The radio crackled. Copy. Name? Martin looked at her again, though he had already been told. Brooks. Alina Brooks. The pause on the other end was longer than it should have been. Then, stand by. Martin lowered the radio but did not apologize. Instead, he said, You can wait over there. again with the rope. Alina shifted her satchel on her shoulder and moved not toward the cafe but toward the Hall of Empire, the long central gallery adjacent to the foyer, where marble busts of colonial administrators stood in cold rows beneath maps colored in conquest. Red. She wanted space, distance from his performance of screening, and perhaps because she was a historian and a person before she was a guest, she wanted to look again at the objects. Sterling's Hall of Empire had long been one of her examples in lectures. A room that accidentally revealed the ideology of the institution by the serenity with which it displayed violent extraction as taste. Martin noticed her movement immediately. "Ma'am," he called, "I asked you to remain in the foyer." She stopped and turned. "I am in the museum. This wing is restricted until the reception begins." A lie, or at best a convenient improvisation. Two tourists had just exited from the far side, brochures in hand. Alina held his gaze. "No, it isn't." For a moment they simply looked at one another, and the thing in the space between them was bigger than policy. It was older. The old insistence that authority could define reality by stating it confidently enough. The older refusal to let it. Martin started walking after her, not close enough to touch, not openly enough to admit he was trailing, but close enough that anybody watching would understand his role in the scene. Alina turned and continued into the gallery. The marble floor sharpened the click of her heels. Above her, banners detailed British campaigns, Belgian trade routes, French expeditions, all rendered in curated language that made empire sound like an adventurous administrative project. Glass cases held looted bronzes, ceremonial textiles, carved figures acquired during military campaigns. Alina slowed before a plaque she had criticized in print 2 years earlier. The museum had updated 3 words and left the moral structure intact. Behind her, Martin stopped at the entrance to the gallery and pretended to inspect a case. She saw his reflection in the glass. That was the thing about people who trail you while denying it. They count on your reluctance to name what is obvious. They hide inside etiquette. They hope your education will become your restraint. A younger museum employee in black catering attire passed with a tray of empty champagne flutes and gave Alina a brief, sympathetic glance. Not enough to intervene. Enough to show she understood what was happening. Alina moved to the next display, a case of artifacts from West Africa, labeled with language so bloodless it almost achieved parody. Taken during pacification efforts, transferred through private collection, later donated. The empire had stolen, killed, fenced, burned, and renamed. The museum had turned that violence into passive verbs and brass labels. She heard Martin behind her again. "Ma'am, I need to ask that you stay visible." Alina turned slowly. "I am visible." He flushed slightly, perhaps hearing too late what he had said. "I mean within monitored areas. This is a monitored area." A couple entering from the opposite side slowed. The man glanced at Martin, then at Alina, and did that familiar public arithmetic some white people do when race and authority share a frame. He tried to determine who was entitled to the benefit of presumption before enough evidence existed to justify his instinct. Alina was tired of that arithmetic. "I'm going to say this once," she said quietly enough that Martin had to listen carefully. "You are following me because you decided I do not fit your idea of who belongs at this event. If you have an actual concern, state it plainly. If not, stop shadowing me." Martin's jaw moved. "I'm doing my job." "No," she said. "You're performing certainty on top of a bias." That landed, not because it changed his mind, because it named the thing he intended to keep foggy. The radio at his shoulder crackled again. He grabbed it too quickly, as though eager for rescue. "Kaler." The voice on the other end was sharper now. "Main foyer. Immediately." Martin frowned. "I'm with the individual." A pause, then, "Yes, we know." He looked at Alina, now irritated rather than confident. "Please return to the foyer." There are moments when vindication arrives before apology, and everyone involved knows which one would have mattered more. Alina followed him back through the Hall of Empire. More people were in the foyer now. Donors, early guests, 2 graduate interns arranging programs. The atmosphere had the tautness of a room that is hurt enough to anticipate revelation. At the center of the foyer stood Dr. Evelyn Pierce. She was a white woman in her late 50s with silver hair, a charcoal silk suit, and the kind of posture that made people around her unconsciously move into order. Her intelligence was the first thing people noticed, her patience the second, and her lack of patience the one that caused actual institutional movement. Beside her stood Camille Reyes, the event coordinator, holding an iPad and looking horrified. The moment Evelyn saw Alina, her face changed, not into surprise, into recognition and immediate anger. "Alina," she said, crossing the marble floor toward her. "I'm so sorry." She reached her first, took both of her hands for a brief second, then turned to Martin with a stillness far more dangerous than shouting. "Why?" Evelyn asked. "Is our guest speaker being detained in the foyer?" Every person within 20 feet heard the title, Guest Speaker. It moved through the room like a dropped crystal glass. Martin opened his mouth. "I was verifying. You were following her through the Hall of Empire," Camille said before he could finish. Martin blinked, wrong-footed now because multiple witnesses had begun to align against his preferred version. "I had not yet received confirmation." Evelyn's expression hardened. "You had her name. You had my office on radio. You had a museum full of staff to contact, and instead you chose to trail Dr. Brooks through the gallery?" Martin did not answer quickly enough. That was answer enough. The older white women near the stairs now looked acutely interested in the marble floor. One donor took out his phone and pretended to check email. The young assistant with the lanyard turned pink with secondhand embarrassment. The catering employee with the tray had returned and was watching openly now, no longer bothering to hide her contempt. Evelyn's voice stayed level. "Apologize." Martin looked at Alina, not truly at her, toward her. "Men who have reduced you in their minds rarely recover personhood quickly once they discover rank attached to your name." "My apologies," he said stiffly. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." Alina held his gaze. "No," she said. "There was a decision." The room went very still. Evelyn did not interrupt. Martin's face colored deeper. "That is not what I—" "It is what happened," Alina said. "You decided I didn't belong before you verified anything, and then you behaved as though my presence near the collection required surveillance." A trustee at the edge of the foyer shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer a private correction. It had become what institutions fear most, a truthful description in front of donors. Evelyn looked at Martin for one long second, then to the security supervisor who had just arrived from the side corridor, breathless and pale. "Mr. Keller is relieved from event duty," she said. "Immediately." The supervisor nodded once. "Understood." Martin took a small step back. "Dr. Pierce, with respect—" "No," Evelyn said. "Not with respect. If respect were present, we would not be having this conversation." Alina stood still. She was aware of every eye in the foyer, of the old pattern trying to recreate itself in reverse now that status had been clarified. The room wanted to turn in her favor because it had discovered who she was. But that was never the true test. The true test had already occurred when they did not know. Evelyn turned back to her. "Please," she said softly, "come upstairs. We're about to begin the reception. And again, I am deeply sorry." Alina nodded. "Thank you." As they began up the stairs, the foyer parted for them in a way it had not parted when she first arrived. There it was again, the speed with which some people recognize dignity only after authority announces it. Camille fell into step on Alina's other side. "I should have been downstairs," she said in a low voice. "This is on us." Alina glanced at her. "It's on the person who made the choice. But yes, institutions are collections of who was where when it mattered." Camille swallowed. "That's fair." Upstairs, the donor reception occupied the east atrium, a glass-roofed space ringed with paintings and temporary exhibit panels. Waiters moved silently with trays. A jazz trio in one corner tuned instruments. Printed programs bore Alina's name in serif lettering. Dr. Alina Brooks, historian and author. The sight of it did not comfort her. It sharpened the insult. Her name had been everywhere tonight except, apparently, in the mind of the man who decided to screen her body before he acknowledged her title. A few guests approached at once. A university provost, a columnist, a donor couple eager to signal sophistication by mentioning her second book. Alina answered with practiced grace. She could do this. She had done it for years, but there was an additional charge in the room now. Whispers had traveled faster than champagne. People were looking at her not just as the speaker, but as the woman from the foyer incident. Some with sympathy, some with curiosity, some with the guilty relief of people glad a thing had been exposed before it happened to them. Evelyn leaned close. "You can cancel," she said quietly. "If you prefer, I'll understand completely." Alina looked out over the atrium, at the trustees, the journalists, the men in dark suits whose institutions purchased moral seriousness by invitation, at the very museum that wanted her scholarship without having prepared its body to recognize her. She thought of leaving. It would have been justified. It would have been clean. But sometimes the room that wounds you is exactly the room that most needs to hear you while the wound is fresh and everyone still knows where it came from. "No," she said. "I'm speaking." Evelyn studied her face, then nodded once. "Then I'll introduce you properly." When the reception ended and the audience moved into the lecture hall, every seat filled. The museum had expected a strong turnout. It had not expected the electric concentration now in the room. People settled with the awareness that something had already happened and might continue happening in more articulate form. The lecture hall was semicircular, wood-paneled, with warm lighting and a stage set with 2 armchairs, a podium, and a projection screen. Alina waited backstage with a glass of water she did not drink. Through the curtain gap, she could see row after row of patrons. Front row trustees, second row academics, further back graduate students and general attendees. She recognized faces from television panels and editorial pages. She also recognized Martin. He was not at the wall now. He sat near the side exit, no longer on duty, his blazer replaced by the self-conscious stillness of a man who had been told to stay but disappear. Somebody in administration must have decided removing him entirely would create more talk. Instead, they had made the classic institutional error of confusing physical distance with moral resolution. Evelyn stepped to the podium. The hall quieted. "Good evening," she said. "Thank you all for joining us for what I know will be an important conversation." She gave the standard remarks first: donors, sponsors, exhibit acknowledgments. Then her tone shifted. "Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to say something plain. Museums are not neutral rooms. We are shaped by what we display, what we omit, who we trust on site, and whose expertise we require introduction to believe. Institutions like ours exist to preserve the past, but too often we also preserve habits of exclusion under the language of standards and procedure. That failure is not theoretical, it is present, and it is ours to confront." The room held its breath. Evelyn looked toward the wing where Alina waited, and when she spoke again, her voice carried both admiration and apology. "It is my honor to introduce Dr. Alina Brooks, one of the most rigorous and influential historians working today, whose scholarship has transformed how we understand empire, memory, public myth, and the afterlife of extraction. She is not simply our guest this evening. She is the person this institution was meant to hear." The applause began strong and grew stronger. Alina stepped onto the stage. There is a particular kind of silence that follows applause when a room realizes the person approaching the podium has already endured something in the building and might decide what to do with that fact in real time. Alina felt all of it: the weight, the anticipation, the attempt, in some faces, to signal support early enough to avoid being counted among the room's failures. She stood at the podium, set down her notes, and looked out. For 3 seconds, she said nothing. The silence lengthened. Then she began. "Thank you, Dr. Pierce." Her voice was warm, low, and carried easily. "I was invited here tonight to speak about empire, memory, and the stories institutions tell in order to make power look inevitable, tasteful, and deserved." A few people shifted. "And I want to begin by saying that historians are often accused of overreading symbols. We are told that a plaque is just a plaque, a title just a title, a security check just a procedure, a room just a room. But if you spend enough years studying empire, you learn to recognize a pattern. The pattern is this: power almost always insists it is merely being orderly while deciding who must prove they belong." The room stilled completely. Alina did not rush. "When you study imperial archives, what strikes you is not only the violence, it is the paperwork, the stamps, the ledgers, the passes, the permits, The classifications, the categories of who may enter, who may carry, who may speak, who may stand where without explanation. Empire loved a document because a document could make domination feel administrative. Someone in the back exhaled audibly. She moved from there into history with devastating precision. British museums built on colonial plunder. French exhibitions that staged subject peoples as educational spectacle. American institutions that celebrated freedom while storing the material evidence of stolen labor in basements and side collections. She spoke without notes for long stretches, connecting conquest to curation, extraction to philanthropy, public memory to the emotional architecture of grand rooms like this one. She named the tricks institutions use to launder violence into legacy. Passive verbs, donor framing, euphemistic wall text, the fetish of preservation separated from justice. And then, about 20 minutes in, she returned. People sometimes ask me why representation matters in institutions of history. They ask as though this were an aesthetic concern, as though the issue were merely who appears in a brochure or serves on a panel. But representation matters because people do not simply bring knowledge into a room. They bring assumptions about where knowledge lives. And those assumptions determine who is welcomed as an authority, who is tolerated as a visitor, and who is surveilled as a possible problem until announced by someone the institution already trusts. No one in the room could pretend not to understand now. Alina did not look toward Martin. She didn't have to. The entire hall had become the looking. She continued, and there was no anger in her tone now, which somehow made it sharper. To be clear, this is not about one awkward encounter. It is about a system of perception. A Black historian in a museum should not have to become legible through introduction before she becomes legible as belonging. If an institution can celebrate Black history on its walls but fail to recognize Black authority in its foyer, then the problem is not its mission statement. The problem is its habits. Several people began to clap, but the applause died quickly because she was not finished. She spent the next half hour dismantling the museum's comfort, but not cheaply, not with slogans, with rigor. She showed how empires taught themselves innocence through aesthetic display, how museums inherited not only objects but hierarchies of trust, how those hierarchies persisted in decisions about hiring, acquisition, interpretation, security, and audience. She spoke of Black scholars whose labor built fields from which they were later excluded, of curators of color asked to diversify collections while whiteboards guarded prestige, of schools that assigned books by Black thinkers while treating Black faculty as exceptions requiring proof. By the time she concluded, the room had the charged quiet of people who knew they had not attended a lecture so much as stood inside an indictment they could not easily dismiss because it was too historically exact. Her final lines landed without theatricality. History is not what institutions say about the past. History is what the past continues doing through them. And the measure of whether a museum has changed is not the boldness of the panel text. It is whether the people entrusted to guard its treasures can recognize a Black woman carrying expertise before another authority figure says her name into a microphone. Then she thanked the audience and stepped back. There was one beat of silence. Then the room rose. Not all at once, not uniformly, but enough. Some stood because they were moved, some because they were ashamed, some because social gravity left them little choice. The applause was long and loud, and no doubt sincere in many corners. Alina accepted it with composure, but she knew better than to confuse applause with transformation. Rooms stand for brilliance all the time and change nothing by morning. Still, a truth spoken in full public view acquires a life of its own. The Q&A that followed was tense, smarter than usual, less self-satisfied. A journalist asked whether museums could ever escape their imperial architecture. Alina said escape was less useful than confession, followed by redesign. A graduate student asked how to enter academia without being consumed by its gatekeeping. Alina told her to find rigorous community faster than she found approval. A trustee asked whether public trust in institutions required preserving decorum even amid conflict. Alina answered, "Decorum without justice is simply a well-dressed delay." That quote would appear online by midnight. Afterward came the reception line, the part Alina liked least. Admiration in compressed form. Handshakes, cards, references to her latest article. a senator's aide, a podcast host, two doctoral students trying not to tremble while telling her she had changed their thinking. Evelyn stayed near, intercepting the worst of the self-congratulatory donors. More than one person began with, "I'm so sorry about what happened earlier." And Alina noticed that some of them sounded genuinely troubled, while others sounded eager to prove their distance from it. She gave no one easy absolution. Then an older white man approached, immaculate in a dark suit, museum pin on his lapel. Theodore Sterling IV, trustee emeritus, heir to the founder's family, donor name on 3 galleries. Alina knew exactly who he was before he spoke. "Dr. Brooks," he said, "magnificent talk. Uncomfortable, of course, but necessary." Uncomfortable, of course. There it was, the patrician version of praise, as though discomfort were an interesting spice he had graciously tolerated. "Thank you," Alina said. He gave a thin smile. "I do hope you understand that most of us are trying." Alina met his eyes. History is full of people who considered trying an adequate substitute for changing. For one brief, perfect second, Theodore Sterling had no reply. Evelyn almost smiled into her champagne flute. Later, near the coat check, Alina found Camille waiting with her satchel and a folded envelope. "Honorarium paperwork," Camille said, then hesitated, "and a formal written apology from the museum director. Not a substitute for anything. Just, it's being documented." Alina took the envelope. "Good." Camille shifted her weight. "There's more. 3 staff members have already submitted incident statements. Apparently this is not the first time, mister. Keller has verified guests more aggressively when they weren't white." Alina nodded once, unsurprised. Rarely is a prejudice this smooth on its first outing. "Will anything happen?" she asked. Camille held her gaze. "Because of tonight?" "Yes, I think so." Alina studied her face. "Because of tonight, or because it happened to someone prominent enough to be embarrassing?" Camille flinched, just slightly. "Both." "That," Alina said, "is also history." Outside, the evening air had cooled. The museum steps glowed under uplighting. Cars lined the curb. Journalists lingered just far enough away to claim restraint while hoping for comment. Alina descended slowly, satchel over her shoulder, the city opening around her in traffic light and autumn wind. At the base of the steps, a young black man in a junior archivist badge caught up to her. He had likely been waiting for a gap, unwilling to impose. "Dr. Brooks?" She turned. He looked about 24, nervous, earnest, with the look of someone who had learned to speak carefully in rooms where eagerness could be mistaken for naivety. "My name's Jonah Fields. I work in collections. I wanted to say thank you for not smoothing it over." Alina's expression softened. He glanced back up at the museum. "Stuff like that happens here more than people know. Not always that obvious, but enough. And when it does, everybody tells themselves it's too small to be the real issue." She nodded. "That's how the real issue survives." Jonah smiled faintly. "I wrote that down." She laughed, and it released something in both of them. "You should," she said. "Write everything down." He hesitated, then said, "You made that room tell the truth about itself." Alina looked back at the museum, at the columns, the banners, the polished calm. "Only for one night," she said. Jonah shook his head. "Sometimes one night is where it starts." Her car arrived. Before she got in, she looked once more toward the entrance. Through the glass doors, she could still see movement in the foyer. Staff, guests, the after-motion of culture, trying to absorb what had just happened without losing shape. Somewhere in there would be meetings, memos, careful language, discussions of policy, maybe consequences, maybe protections, certainly discomfort. The institution would decide whether to preserve itself or improve itself, and most likely attempt a little of both. By morning, clips from the lecture had spread far beyond the museum. Someone had posted the final 6 minutes online. Then a local arts reporter published a piece about the incident in the foyer and the lecture that followed. Then a national outlet picked it up under a headline less elegant than the evening deserved, but accurate enough. Museum guard questioned Black historian before Curator introduced her as keynote speaker. The story moved because it was recognizable. Too recognizable. Black professionals across fields saw themselves in it immediately. Lawyers mistaken for defendants, doctors mistaken for janitorial staff, professors mistaken for assistants, executives asked to wait while someone found the real person in charge. The details changed, the structure stayed. The Sterling Museum issued a statement by noon. It praised Dr. Brooks's vital contribution. It acknowledged a deeply regrettable breach in guest protocol. It announced an independent review of security procedures and bias training. The statement was polished, defensive at the edges, earnest in parts. It read like what happens when legal counsel and public embarrassment split a paragraph between them. Martin Kaler was placed on administrative leave, which was not justice but was at least an institutional recognition that his behavior could no longer be filed under professionalism. By week's end, two former guests had come forward with similar accounts. One was a black conservator from Atlanta who said she had been followed in the same wing the previous year while preparing for a private viewing. Another was a Nigerian donor's wife who had been asked 3 separate times whether she was with the catering team. The museum's problem had not begun with Alina. It had merely met someone unwilling to let it remain anecdotal. 3 weeks later, Alina received another invitation from Evelyn Pierce, not for a lecture, for a closed working session with museum leadership and department heads on institutional trust, security culture, and curatorial authority. Alina considered declining. She owed them nothing. But then she thought of Jonah in collections, of the catering worker with the sympathetic glance, of the interns watching from the stairs, of every young black scholar who would one day walk into some marble building with a satchel and a title, and a body read before the title had the chance to speak. So she went. This time when she entered the Sterling Museum, there were no delays in the foyer. The front desk staff greeted her by name. A new security supervisor met her with an access badge already printed. The efficiency was almost comic. Institutions become very competent when humiliation has become expensive. Alina took the badge, looked at it, and said, "Interesting what can happen when recognition is treated like a discipline instead of a favor." The supervisor, to his credit, did not pretend not to understand. Inside the boardroom, under portraits of dead benefactors, Alina spent 3 hours telling senior leadership what they had not built and what that failure had cost them. She explained that bias in security was not a side issue but an interpretive issue, that a museum cannot claim authority over history while reproducing the social logic of the histories it displays, that every guard, greeter, donor liaison, and department head participates in public meeting, that racism in institutions often enters not through explicit policy, but through unchallenged intuition elevated into practice. Some of them listened defensively, some listened honestly. Evelyn listened like a person keeping score against her own institution because she intended to force it to do better. Theodore Sterling IV attended too, and this time he said very little, which was improvement. After the session, Jonah caught Alina in the corridor outside manuscripts and handed her a small note card. "Just wanted you to have this," he said. On it, he had written one line from her lecture in careful block letters. "History is what the past continues doing through us." She smiled. "You really did write it down." "You told me to." Months later, the museum reopened the Hall of Empire with revised text, a new introductory panel, and an audio installation featuring scholars from formerly colonized nations speaking back to the collection. It was not a revolution. Many objects remained where they had been. Restitution debates were ongoing. Donors still preferred moral complexity as long as it did not threaten endowments. But the room had changed. More importantly, the language had changed. And in institutional life, language is often where the old order first reveals whether it intends to survive intact. Alina returned one final time that winter, not for a lecture, but on her own, unannounced. Snow flurried against the museum steps. Inside, the foyer glowed quietly in late afternoon light. No one stopped her at the door. A young guard nodded and said, "Good afternoon, Dr. Brooks." She nodded back and walked into the Hall of Empire. The marble busts were still there, though 2 had been moved to side alcoves. Several plaques now named theft as theft. A new wall text near the entrance acknowledged that museums had long mistaken possession for stewardship and neutrality for innocence. Alina stood before it for a while. Then she noticed, mounted discreetly near the base of the introductory panel, a smaller line in silver lettering. This gallery was reinterpreted in consultation with scholars, including Dr. Alina Brooks. She looked at it, unreadable for a moment. Credit was not the point. It never had been. But truth left traces. And sometimes a trace in the right wall was evidence that a room had, at minimum, been forced to remember the day it failed, and the person who would not let it call failure a misunderstanding. As she turned to leave, a black mother entered the gallery holding the hand of a girl no older than 10. The girl looked around with wide, serious eyes and asked, "Mama, who changed all this writing?" The mother glanced at the panels, then at Alina, though she did not recognize her, and said, "People who knew it wasn't telling the truth before." Alina walked on without speaking. Outside, the city was cold and bright. Traffic moved. People hurried past under coats and scarves. Behind her, the museum stood as grand as ever, but not quite as innocent. And that, she thought, was sometimes how justice arrived in old institutions. Not as collapse, as exposure, as correction, as a refusal to let dignity wait in the foyer until someone more acceptable announced it from the stage. If this story moved you, subscribe, like the video, and stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting.